Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a show that looks at the way technology, politics, and policy impacts the world around us, the tools we use, the way services are delivered, and how we talk about and set policy all shape our society. We'll gather around and have a chat about these things together and more. Before we get started, I do want to let you all know that we've started a Discord for the podcast. There will be a link with an invite down in the episode description. Do feel free to go check that out. It's a small community right now, but hoping to grow it. It's a great way to reach out to me and let me know things that you might want us to cover, or to just hang out and talk about civic tech. Thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. Could you, reintroduce yourself as you're a podcast alum and tell us a bit about what you do?
Thanks so much. So my name is R. Schrock, and I am right now a professional editor and writing coach. But when I wrote this book, I really was a researcher of communication, and specifically political communication and social media. And I still am interested in these topics, but I've kind of moved from researching them to working on a lot of books and articles written by other people writing on them. So I'm still in the mix, but just in a slightly different way.
And what would you say is your personal why? The thing that drives you to get out of bed each morning and do all of that?
It's going to sound corny, but I guess to make a difference. I know how Pollyanna-ish that sounds, but I really do like working, particularly with researchers, graduate students, early career academics, to help them write a better book and improve their writing and improve their research. Um, and I'm a nerd. I can't kind of hide it. Yeah, if it's not clear from this book, I just really like understanding the meta context of things, that gray area knowledge. And that's the ground on which I kind of built my business as an editor and writing coach.
Your recent book, Politics Recoded, is one that provides some research and some history into an organization called Code for America. Many folks listening may be aware of it, but why did you seek to write a book on this topic?
Well, I think through Code for America, we understand the evolution of what we can broadly call digital politics as a whole. And I'm always looking out as a researcher for that kind of small site or phenomena that tells a bigger story. And I actually kind of stumbled into this. Around 2012, in 2013, I started going to a lot of civic hackathons, other events, and I just kept on running into people from Code for America. I remember running into the first year of fellows for the city of Long Beach, which is where I live, which included Fury and Dan Gettleman. And I just kind of kept on, showing up to these events. And so naturally, I kind of gravitated towards the organization. And I should say that at the start, I thought the story was not that interesting. And I don't mean that in a dissy way. I just didn't have a grasp of the big story that it told. Um, but I kept on kind of showing up, and around 2015, a lot of interesting things happened. Like that's sort of like 2015, 2016, there were a lot of different efforts going on at Code for America and, about digital politics and organizing around it. And I found those fascinating. And that's what really the book is about. And it's also about how these undercurrents really change the organization itself. The other thing I'd say is that I was motivated to write this book because, to be entirely frank, I was like taking classes in organizational communication at USC Annenberg, which is where I got my PhD. And so I was looking for a vehicle and a way to talk about these things. And so, I was working, I was like Henry Jenkins's research assistant for a while. I was part of Anne Balsamo's research group. She's a really renowned techno-feminist, and Francois Barr is my advisor, who's really a someone who brings community organizing together with technical practice. And so there are all these kind of ideas swirling around, and Code for America ended up being like an interesting vehicle for a lot of those ideas. And I think ultimately I wrote this book to show kind of two things. One, that organizations change over time, um, particularly these types of tech forward organizations change over time, and that technological practice changes politics, but that's not natural or fated to be one thing, right? So I think there's this idea that like, oh, Silicon Valley shows up to City Hall and, they're beholden to, Elon Musk. And I actually found something very different where, a lot of the actors in the nonprofit tech space really didn't have a whole lot of power. And so they really had to be creative in terms of getting into those rooms and doing the things that they wanted to do. So I think the dimensionality of that story is what kept me coming back.
Before we get too deep into your research and the historical context you wrote about, we're going to talk about Code for America, a phrase that's going to be said a lot probably in this conversation. For folks that maybe might not be as familiar with the organization, how would you describe it to them?
I describe Code for America as a tech forward nonprofit working at the state and local levels. So that kind of puts it in a fairly small niche in 2009 when it started. There really weren't that many organizations doing that. These days, that's actually a fairly big area. You see a lot of synonyms, civic tech being one of those terms, also public interest technology. And, there are a lot of, I think, things going on now that more organizations are doing. When it first started, I think the idea of geeks working with government was quite new. You didn't really have that frame for understanding what that would look like or what would happen. But on a fundamental level, I think Code for America is a tech forward nonprofit organization, and it also represents what I just call infrastructural politics, which is both kind of working on digital infrastructure as a political activity, and then also the infrastructural organizing around that effort.
The book's introduction quotes former Mayor Garcetti, which I'm hoping I'm pronouncing correctly,
Mm-hmm.
of Los Angeles, where he said to a crowd, "You have the power to be the government." What are you hoping folks take away from this opening?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on this and use this as kind of a first question to get us into the discussion. I think it was this moment where there were a lot of actors at the state and local level who are interested in, riding this tide of interest that Code for America was also as well. And, you saw this earlier in the 1970s when the idea of participation started entering our vocabulary. And these days, I think Garcetti shows us is that he's really interested in volunteers taking on, the roles and the things that administrators have historically done, and then some, maybe, right? So I think it also, I think, hopefully shows the big spectacle of these events. And that's something that returns in a lot of different ways throughout the book, particularly through the events that Jen Palka put on, because she came from a world where she was working on organizing game events and then also, working on Tim O'Reilly events. And so the idea of the spectacle and, kind of having a literal stage, really comes back throughout the book. And I think this vignette really shows this moment where it becomes plausible for people to volunteer their labor through technological practice.
In your answer before, you used the term infrastructural organizing, and I imagine it's going to be one that's going to come back in our conversation. It seems like something that's important as a theme to the book itself. It's in the subtitle. I think in the introduction it gets mentioned, and I believe you kind of start to build and define on it throughout the book. As folks read and want to follow along, what should folks know about that concept to be able to do so?
Yeah, and I think this is a term that I came up with. And so, if there is, remember, this is an academic book, it's published by an academic press. So this is how academics write. Like you have a concept that you're infusing with meaning throughout the book. It's a term to me that's both historical and analytical. So historically, it describes this moment in time from, I would say, 2009 to 2020/2021, in the evolution of this fusion of technical practice and organizing and politics. So it starts with the idea of like networks and Web 2.0. I mean, you have to really put yourself in that mindset. When was the last time anyone talked about Web 2.0, right? But that's where we start with the idea of networks, Web 2.0, government as a platform. These ideas that people like Clay Shirky and Tim O'Reilly are writing about the possibility of openness and collective action changing politics as a whole. If you remember, Tim O'Reilly would write about, against the vending machine model of politics, where you simply put in money and get services. He would say, well, we have to kind of participate in politics itself, right? Um, Over time, a lot of new ideas got attached to, I think, this idea of infrastructural organizing. Prototypes end up being really important because the ideas that people came up with needed like a material vehicle, like a proof of concept. Like, look at this app. This shows what government would be like, more simplified, more attuned to our needs, if we simply kind of found a way to use it, right? Another idea, of course, is networks. That thing never goes away, right? And this is also a lesson about political organizing. And I think it's Dave Karp who writes a lot about what he calls sedimentary organizations, right? That you have practices that, sediment like, silt, right? And they never go away. So, for instance, data was a really big rallying cry for Code for America, I would say around 2015, 2016. It never has gone away. You still see that come up. You know, and so a lot of these ideas kind of go into the organization and become part of how people think about their organizing. To the point that when I refer to infrastructural organizing, I'm referring to not just building digital infrastructure, but the organizers themselves becoming infrastructural. They're pieces in a larger puzzle, and the ideas that they bring to the organization through things like networks, prototypes, expertise become a vehicle for doing politics. And when you look at infrastructural organizing, it looks different than, for instance, traditional hierarchical organizations or even corporations like Meta, the way that they kind of organize their workers. It's distinct. And that's why I refer to it as an analytical term as well, because it doesn't just help me tell a history, but I think we're living in an era of infrastructural organizing. It's really become the water we swim in, essentially, and we just don't notice it because it's now extremely common.
In the book, you talk about how some early work that at Code for America did took this approach that you describe as parachuting geeks into government. You go on to talk about how this led to things getting to that proof of concept stage that I think you mentioned in your previous answer a little bit,
Mm.
and that stuff would often turn into vaporware, which for folks unfamiliar with that term, that's like unused software or something that doesn't like get to its like promised state in software terms. In your view, how did this approach they took lead to those sorts of outcomes?
Yeah, this is where I would say, most pessimistic about Code for America. I would say other chapters, I actually really do admire a lot of what they did. But in early days, I mean, Jen Palka herself has been pretty explicit in interviews and presentations about really not having very much in the early days, right? So you put yourself in her shoes, right? You're building an organization. You need to show that you're doing something. You need working evidence of geeks changing politics. So, kind of the early idea was this thing called fellowships. Fellowships would generally be around three people who would get a contract with local government, and Code for America would negotiate that contract to work on a project that mattered to government and possibly other partners in the city or town where they were doing the work. For example, in Long Beach, they partnered with the Molina Foundation, which is does healthcare. So unsurprisingly, the stuff that they did was related to healthcare and also mattered to local government as well. Um, so why didn't the fellowships work? I think the simplest way to describe it is that Code for America didn't think through the challenges very well, and so there was a lot that had to happen in a year, right? So the fellowships would just be a year. Government moves very slowly. Tech culture moves very fast. And a lot of the time when geeks show up and they're just like, hey, here's our PowerPoint pitch for what we think needs to be done, that actually didn't end up being a great way to get the kind of political capital that is necessary in government, right? Because that's not how government culture works. You need to stick around, and a lot of the ways that you get and develop capital, by which I just mean, kind of material resources, and then also things like reputation, right? This person is a known quantity. They'll do a good job at this. Um, that takes a whole lot of time. So that's one thing. Trying to move too quickly and perhaps breaking things, right? Also, kind of misunderstanding things like policies and laws, right? So, HIPAA violations, right? You can't actually access, in Long Beach, this ended up being a thing. It didn't actually, I think, ultimately sink the project, but it did end up being a pretty big bump in the road. And then also the fact that as much as we might look to Code for America and be like, oh, it was birthed by the tech industry, Code for America is not like, Hewlett Packard's public sector wing, Code for America is never going to get $100 million contracts to build platforms for government, as much as it talks like that sometimes. So in some cases, I think they actually misunderstood the power that they had in these spaces for reasons other than, trying to move too quickly. I think they just didn't understand that, vendors end up being really powerful. These huge non, these huge organizations that have public sector, they're doing business, the same kind of business they do in the private sector, just in the public sector, and they're freaking gigantic, right? I mean, they could eat Good for America for lunch, and pick their teeth with their bones. So, in a lot of ways, I'm actually, although I'm very pessimistic about fellowships, I'm sympathetic to, like, what they were trying to do, because they were trying to do something really ambitious. And really, I think their hearts were in the right place, but it just ended up being, producing a lot of just, projects that were just another tombstone in the civic tech project graveyard, unfortunately. And if you don't believe me, you can, go look at the Code for America GitHub and draw your own conclusions.
As that work went on, the book covers this group of folks that you talk about as a new guard of designers. They came into the organization and had a rather significant impact with their presence. This included things like pushing the organization to face its own whiteness, trying to attract a more representative workforce, and seeking to tell empathetic stories about those that are impacted by government services, among many other things covered by their effort. I wound up highlighting a phrase that you wrote stating, "Empathy let Code for America make powerful claims that infused administrative work with racial sensitivity." How do you view the role these folks played in not just changing the internal organization, but also their seeking to influence government services themselves?
Yeah, this was an important chapter for me to tell. To be entirely candid, I don't know if I did a great job in this chapter. If you're listening and you research this stuff, write about the things that I write about in this chapter, but just do a better job, honestly. Just because I think this story is still ongoing and I don't know quite where it ends. But I do think in terms of the Code for America world and its history, what I saw is that there was a movement from, working on technology. We talked about the fellowships, like you're gonna make an app. What ended up happening here is that the employees really ended up working more on, for instance, recruitment and showing that Code for America, when it's doing recruitment for government services, can be more empathetic than government as a whole. And so what sometimes that involved using technology, but a lot of the time it was just kind of boring stuff like using Facebook ads to target otherwise minoritized or disempowered groups, right? Who are eligible for government services. It's a different way of using technology, and it's a different situating of Code for America in the nonprofit landscape, right? Um, and I do think it does. I think two things happened too. Part of it was what you said, which is that there were new people who ended up kind of bringing new ideas to the organization. And at every point, I think, really based on their labor and what they were doing. And I know it wasn't easy always, trying to advocate for, doing it a different way. Um, that said, I also, believe, Jen Palco, we might critique some things that she's done, but I do think she had her heart in the right place in terms of how she thought about, things like the brigades, which I do think she promoted internally, and also diversifying the groups who were participating in Code for America. And at some points, for instance, like with, some of the advisory groups, she really, was like literally at times like, this can't just be a bunch of dudes. We gotta have some women and people who aren't men in there, right? I think part of it is, the employees advocating for a new way of doing things and the slow osmosis of ideas from employees to the fabric of the organization. And these ideas hopefully working their way up to the organizational strategy and C-suite level, hopefully. That's one part of the story. I think the other part of the story is it became very politically unpalatable, particularly after, the 2016 election, to, be completely naive to questions of race and gender and power. And so you did see that kind of, organizing around those ideas simply became something that Code for America could get funding for, practically speaking. And so I think that's another reason why it didn't happen earlier. So it's not like people like Catherine Bracy weren't advocating for more egalitarian perspectives on tech organizing, where they're directly empowering people of color. I think she was, and she, was explicit with, like, when she talked with me, that was a goal. It's just there wasn't really an appetite for doing that at that particular time, in like 2012. as there was in like, 2017, 2018, when a lot of those things changed. So, I know it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but I think those people were also kind of part of the organization at the right time to change those things. I also think it's important to note that I mentioned I don't know where this story ends. I don't know if the Amanda Renfria era, if these ideas will persist. And really, my research with Code for America ended about 2.5 years ago. So there's probably been even more things changing. And I don't know what those things are. That's why I sort of, kick the ball to whoever else wants to write about this stuff. Follow this thread though. I do think it's important, and I would love to see where it's going these days.
You also talk about Code for America's role as a storytelling organization or as a manager of myths, which I think is a phrase that was used. So they were kind of a place where stories could be brought together and then shared and used to pursue various organizational aims, as one might imagine. How is this role as that manager of myths important?
To clarify, I don't mean that this term is a pejorative. Like, it's not an insult being like, oh, myths are bad. Like, we all need myths. Just look at our current presidential race and the ways that stories that may or may not be particularly true get raised to the level of um, being central to organizing. Like, um, the whole idea of an American identity, what it looks like to be an American. We're this is kind of being played out right now, and so you do have like competing myths. So in terms of Code for America, I think storytelling was what the higher ups could do at a high level at things like the yearly summits that really were targeting people who both were inside local government and potential funders. It could help them tell a big story that the world is changing. You can be part of this progressive change, right? And to put a different way, I have a chapter that's kind of about how they worked with ideas of citizenship. The idea of volunteers being digitally enabled citizens, and they exist at the local level. And there's this whole movement that ends up being a big keyword of people interested in doing this work. That's way more fundable, to like the Knight Foundation than them just being like, hey, we can fix your website. You know what I mean? One is sort of this pragmatism, and another is like this big story of progressive change. And one is, at the end of the day, one is way more persuasive than the other. And I think that's still true. I've gotten a few emails from people who have worked with Code for America who seem to think the book is about getting storytelling or mythologizing out of politics and just being sort of a raw pragmatism, like this is what we're doing with the technology. That's not really my argument. I don't think we're ever going to get storytelling out of politics. It's always going to be there because that's how we think as humans, and that's what we find persuasive. Um, but it's just something we really need to pay attention to if we're going to understand infrastructural organizing, right? That stories are what bring people together, not necessarily technology. Maybe stories about technology, but not technology itself.
And I'd like to shift our topic a bit to talk a bit about the network. I think we've mentioned the term brigade a couple of times, and the term network. But eventually, Code for America, as this work continued, found itself at the center of an assortment of semi independent organizations spread out all over the country, often around municipalities and other similar sorts of communities. Many of them had direct relationships with that 501c3 nonprofit entity Code for America has, though some ultimately became their own organizations outright as nonprofits or other types of corporations. How
Yeah.
would you describe how these groups were like?
Yeah, so I think I think the network is used by Code for America in the abstract, where it's like everyone who has ever been part of Code for America. And they are, and again, this is not unusual with nonprofits, they collect email addresses, have newsletters, and are in constant contact with both volunteers and employees. That's not unusual. But I think the philosophy of the network is important. Brigades specifically were really important for Code for America because, as someone who would prefer to remain anonymous put it to me, without the brigades, Code for America is Code for California. And I think that's funny, but it's also very true because it the brigades let Code for America show that nationwide reach in a way that simply the fellowships did not. Um, and where the brigades came from is a bit of a long story. Plug for the book, buy the book. But very briefly, uh, Code for America conducted a lot of very tech related experiments. A lot of it was related to this problem that the fellowships brought up was that no one really used the tech after it got completed. And to Code for America, they were like, well, maybe we can put it on GitHub and build a community around that. Again, made sense at the time. And there are people for whom GitHub is something to rally around, and I don't want to diminish them. However, that eventually went turned into what we now call the brigades. Jennifer Palka and Abhi Namani kind of helped write a grant for Google. And a lot of it was really modeled on CityCamp. Um, and it was really designed to take advantage of what they saw as an opportunity, which was really that they got more applications for fellowships than they expected. So, they had like 500 more applications than they had spots. And so it's like, what do we do with all this labor, right? And the solution ended up being what was initially just called, for fans of Code for America. And so it's for people who were volunteers but didn't necessarily make it into the fellowships where they were, paid a small, admittedly kind of paltry wage when compared to the tech industry, but something to kind of live on. These would be like the volunteer wing. And a lot of the initial brigades were built on top of or bootstrapped, if you will, to the Evite scene, I guess, or the meetup scene of that era. Beta NYC is one of them. I mean, they pre-existed Code for America. Others were entirely new. But basically, they had a very light contract, we could say, with Code for America, where they would agree not to, abuse the essentially naming rights of Code for America. But they were allowed to get some kind of, initially financial support and later on more sort of other types of resources like technology and thought leadership and access to events. But that would help them organize on the local level and do Code for America like things in a volunteer capacity. So that's sort of where they came from. And I think Code for America still thought about its role really not as an organization that would control these brigades, but really more as a convener. So these volunteer groups would open up space for discussions and technological practice and really tackle like local issues. And this goes back to like Jen's work running gaming events and Tim O'Reilly's whole thing, not creating the message, but as he still puts in his Twitter profile, watching the alpha geeks, right? So paying attention to what these technically inclined people are doing and kind of building a structure around it. That's the starting point. And then the brigades went off in all sorts of different directions and ran into kind of their own problems that eventually became unmanageable for Code for America, and they basically shuttered the effort 2 years or so ago.
The book mentions messaging around the network being a movement, which I'll kind of do the like scare quotes with my hands. Obviously, folks can't see us in the podcast, but people will talk about this a lot at events like Brigade Congress, where kind of the folks from the network would come together And I remember there being like very spirited conversations about the validity of the messaging that they were seeing at the event. Like, what's your take on that kind of movement statement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm personally not as interested in the authenticity of it. I think it's fair to say in a traditional social movement sense, if we think about social movements as being organized around issues that transcend things like race and class and gender, even though they might be organized around them, we can think about marches for racial equality and organizing around things like school integration, right? A lot of folks in those movements were, of course, Black, but there were folks who weren't, who were organizing in solidarity with folks who were Black. And so you did see sort of a transcending of questions of race. It's not a social movement like that. I think it's interesting to me that they use the metaphor of the social movement, and I'm interested in the work that idea does. And I think the work that idea does is that the idea of a movement makes it plausible that there is kind of almost a spiritual connection among everyone. And regardless of where they are, right? We're all sort of pursuing a lot of the same goals. And that there's an ethos that pervades the organization beyond what is kind of written on paper or discussed. And I think that kind of spiritual element ended up being really important. So, as much as we might kind of dispute the idea of it being a formal movement, like, social movement scholars would look at this and be like, yeah, a bunch of like educated geeks, it doesn't really seem movement-y to me. They would probably give a polite response like that. I do think it's important to pay attention to not just the veracity of it and be like, look, this is bogus, but to kind of be like, well, why did this work? Why was this organizationally effective at this particular moment in time? That's sort of my North Star in this book. Like, why was this messaging effective right now? Why did this idea take off and not others? Because Code for America, if anything, floats like a million different messages at any particular time, and they're just kind of chumming the water. It's like throwing it out there, see what rises. Again, very Tim O'Reilly thing. Like, I'm going to publish a million books. Some of them are going to be bestsellers, It's thinking that way. So we're going to throw a lot of ideas out there and see what rises. And I think the idea of a social movement came at a time when people were really ready to think about themselves as being more than just people engaged in technical practice, right? So more than just a bunch of nerds working on apps as a social movement. That sounds a lot more compelling, particularly if you are interested in, as I think Code for America was, in broadening the sphere of technical practice. And I haven't mentioned this before, at its start, Code for America really didn't have very many technically inclined people on staff. Like, they didn't have their first data scientist until like 2017. If you were like a tech company, this would be unthinkable, right? They always worked with technology, but more the metaphor of it, the image of it, and then a lot of the actual practice of it, they sort of promoted, but they didn't have people on staff who were like, I'm going to build a Facebook until very much later. And I think Jen resisted that, honestly, for good reason. I think it would just be a little bit of a boondoggle. Like, it would just pull them in, and they didn't have the resources for it. But they did do something kind of similar, but also different. We'll talk about that with the narrow play in a minute, I think.
In my own adventures, kind of through events and things at Code for America, doing this podcast, doing interviews, I've had a number of folks that I won't name here, as I think they probably would want to remain anonymous. But the take they expressed was that there's this kind of tension that would develop as some brigades would join the network. And early on in that life cycle, they're like very useful. As you talked about, there's that like national reach advantage that the organization would get from, a brigade existing in a city, um, and that helps with that storytelling role we've been talking about. But then, as some of those organizations got stronger and kind of built their own reputations, there would be this kind of thing that would come up where they'd be able to, well, say no to the kind of that HQ. Maybe some initiative would come up and they would decide that a local issue is more important. Remembering these conversations made me think about the story you told, for example, of the organization in Tulsa and their interaction with that reimagining 911 theme for the 2021 National Day of Civic Hacking. What do you think of this take that folks have had kind of expressed?
Yeah, I think that's correct, and it's important to think about why. So, talking with Carlos Moreno and the Code for Tulsa folks, yeah, they were just kind of like, yeah, we don't want to like reimagine 911 because that's what people call when, they want to, report someone suspicious in their neighborhood, and we sort of know how that goes. Um, and also there's already organizations devoted to like doing that. So, um, I think at some point, the brigades started, they were always kind of autonomous. They always were given a lot of space and room to move. But yeah, at some point they started developing differing ideas about how things should go. And I think this happened for a number of reasons. One of which is that sometimes you honestly just had strong personalities with the brigades. Sometimes they were benevolent, sometimes they were somewhat self-centered. But, what I've heard a lot from brigades is that, there were one or two people who were really running these things. And some of them were really candid to me and were just like, yeah, if I don't wake up tomorrow and do this thing, no one else is going to do it. On a good day, those people might be interested in, really pro-social things and things that would help their local community. In other cases, they really saw it, and I single out, someone in my local city who did this. They were really just interested in their own kind of gains and saw the brigade as really a vehicle for publicizing themselves and making their local profile larger. And to me, that's not what it's about. And in fact, to be entirely candid, I don't think this is in the book, but I talked with Code for America, and they were like, yeah, oh no, I do talk about this in the book. I was like, yeah, what do we do about this? And they were like, well, if you just create a competing brigade in your city, then maybe that bad actor will forget to file the paperwork to be a brigade. And I'm like, that's the solution. So it was always this kind of rhizomatic spread, and Code for America never wanted to get, too deep in the weeds of either managing the brigades or mediating conflicts. And I understand why. It's labor intensive. There weren't ever a whole lot of people devoted to brigades, and I think they did the best that they could with the resources they had. So, that's like one thing I think, strong personalities, conflicts about, what should be done. Another example that I use is the Open Oakland situation where, there was an app that was, basically a crime heat map application that, hey, in the early 2010s may have seemed plausible. But a lot of the people who started coming to Open Oakland were like, yeah, a lot of these things that you call crime are actually reflecting, not crime itself, but crime reports. And those crime reports tend to occur more predominantly in lower income communities of color. And a lot of them were themselves from these communities. So they kind of showed up and were like, what the heck? So sometimes it was about the technology too. And then finally, I think the master kind of frames, and coming back to Tulsa, um, this clash between like, we're doing this for the community and we're doing it for the government. Code for America liked to do both of those things. They would be like, it's community and government, and sometimes like these terms meant the same thing. But when it came to like the community partners, like the reimagining 911 thing, it's like, yeah, we don't want to do that because that could harm the community. Same thing with Open Oakland. Like we're doing this for the community, and so we're gonna, privilege local partners first. Some people like Varnell and McCann, they were really explicit in the Code for America sphere in terms of saying, well, we want to empower the organizations over necessarily the government because there's a long history of government violence and things like this. So um, all of these things together don't actually explain what killed the brigades. I think what killed the brigades is that after they got a lot of money, basically, this is going to sound paradoxical. Code for America got a large grant, and they basically were looking at how to justify all of their different program efforts, as organizations do, right? They're like, well, we're putting, this many millions of dollars into this, and what are we getting back? Um, Essentially, they couldn't justify keeping the brigades on. I think it ended up just being both a strategy decision and a money decision. So I think, and again, this is me reading the tea leaves. No one has ever said this to me explicitly because, for obvious reasons, I didn't get too many interviews from like the executive level of Code for America. But I do think it no longer fit in with the organizational strategy. And then also, it just became something rather expensive that the organization had trouble justifying, even though they just got a big chunk of money. Um, and and then ultimately they, again, the brigades became a big management burden, right? So to actually do justice to what the brigades were trying to do would require a lot more money and labor than I think Code for America was willing to devote to it. And this just happens a lot of the time. Honestly, I'm shocked the brigades. I thought the brigades would fizzle around 2018, 2017. There were like a couple like events I went to, and every time I went to them and I talked with the brigade folks, I'm like, well, that's it for the brigades. But they stayed on for actually a really long time. I'm actually shocked that the brigades made it to 2022, honestly. And I think the other factor was probably my read is that Jen Palka really supported the brigades. Like she could have killed the brigades in a second. They were always a money suck. They were always, yeah, no offense to the brigade folks listening, I love y'all, but it was just difficult to manage all these different groups that were totally unprepared for it. So I do think Jen Palka really did, believe in the brigades and kept them in the mix because, she could have, taken them away very much earlier, and she never did. And I do think the passing of the baton to Amanda really had something to do with that. Um, the, Again, I don't really have like the inside scoop here. This is just all like the different things I saw going on and what I can conclude based on the evidence in front of me.
I think that's a good segue into that narrow play topic that we promised the listeners we'd get to. And that's that Code for America eventually decided to pursue this thing that you refer to as the narrow play. Can you tell us about like what was this choice? And I think you started to get into this a bit, but like why do you think that choice was made?
So that's a great question. Where did the narrow play come from and why did it happen? I do think that the narrow play came out of a lot of fairly heated debates internally about what the organization would do. And these debates happened when Jen Palka went to work for US Digital Service and really lead that effort. And in that vacuum, my impression is that there was a lot more discussion than usual about the direction the organization would take. And you really had kind of two camps. One camp looked to UK digital service as a model, right? Different system, parliamentary system, not this federated system we have in the US with the local, state, and federal levels, right? Very different. Parliamentary has more control in general. But basically looking to them and being like, well, they're doing a platform play. They're putting up a website for, benefits. Maybe we can do that for local government too. There's an effort called Chime for Oakland that was kind of the pilot project or prototype for that, right? So, um, the idea, hence Chime, digital front door, right? Ring the doorbell, you get it, Chime, right? Um, so there was that effort. And then there were other people who were working on things like what would become Get Cal Fresh and Clear My Record. And those were really more directly oriented towards benefiting people, right? So, like, people need to get access to these benefits, right? And we're always coming in short based on the money that's going in. We're not getting enough people enrolled. In Clear My Record, the opportunity was like low level marijuana convictions, like you wouldn't actually even, have charges pressed against you since it's, now legal in California, right? Yet a lot of people are in jail. A lot of people of color, in particularly, are jailed for that. So we should probably get them out. So there ended up being two kind of competing routes forward. I thought this was really interesting too, because at the start I mentioned like there's not one natural way that like technology plus government equals like one thing. There's not like one equation that describes that. And in fact, internal to Code for America, there was a vibrant discussion about this. Um, Ultimately, I think the Chime effort didn't win out for a variety of reasons. I think not the least of which is I think when Jen came back, she thought, the Get Cal Fresh and Clear My Record efforts had more legs. I don't think she was ultimately that interested in building websites for government. If you think about what makes for a compelling value proposition, right? A lot of people can make websites. Probably not a lot of people can do what these niche projects did. And I call it the narrow play because, it focuses really on these narrow problems, not the broad ones. And it also takes a narrow path to funding. The other thing that I think is important to realize is that because Code for America was not creating technology, they didn't have to be beholden to laws and regulations about coming up with proposals, right? So there's this whole like RFP process for like producing proposals to create, let's say, a website for government. It ends up being a huge pain. But hey, if you're working on improving recruitment for government services, guess what? You can submit a no bid contract and, not basically go through that same time and labor intensive process, right? So I think that was really appealing too, because at the time, I do think the organization was trying to figure out what it would do next for money. Because a lot of the enthusiasm about Web 2.0 and networks and yada yada was fizzling out. And they were like, well, what do we do? How do we get funding? Even as a nonprofit, that's maybe especially as a nonprofit, that's always a question. And so I do think, again, that it's the political opportunity that there were existing routes for doing this, and then also the internal kind of debates. And so that is how Code for America became what it once derided, which is just a government contractor, essentially, right? They used to make fun of them, and now it's like, well, that's what we do, and that's how it happened.
It sounds a bit like you mentioned, like at the very beginning of our discussion, their kind of approach to trying a lot of things, particularly like with like messaging. It sounds like maybe this is like a reflection of that kind of thinking where they've experimented with and tried a lot of different ways to work in
Hmm.
this space, and this turned out to be the one that they thought was like the most promising for viability. Am I kind of like picking that up correctly?
Yeah, and again, I don't I think the idea of viability is important. What exactly, the calculus was that, the executive level and Jen Palka kind of, how they made this decision is a little bit opaque to me, but it is clear that that's where they came down with it on it because the Chime effort and the idea of platforms didn't really that didn't continue. And so to me, because these other things continued at some point, that had to be a decision. And again, this is what happens when you don't really have organizational strategy other than let's see what works. That's been like one weird thing about Code for America is like the recipe is something like come up with a prototype, see if you can get the attention and funding, see if you can scale it, and that's sort of like a master frame that I come back to at the end of the book. If you can scale that into a larger project that's viable and you can build a whole team around, right? That's what I call infrastructural organizing, and that's been how Code for America approaches these problems. They don't sort of say, like other nonprofits do, like, here's what, here, and again, I know they have like a value statement and stuff, but a lot of it's really nebulous to me. A lot of organizations are like, we are involved in, human rights, or we are organizing around racial equality, and we're doing it in these particular ways. Code for America was always kind of like scrambling around, being like, well, what's working? Who can help us? Like, what grants can we apply this stuff to? And that was really tough, honestly, particularly for the employees.
Continuing on with this organizational decision making thread we're on, recall a passage from the book that says, placing culture over structure and relying on ambiguous messaging worked far better for Code for America's institutional positioning, membership negotiation, and self structuring than for coordinating its employees. Which I think with your last comment, you were maybe kind of getting to there. You go on to describe how this was paired with a tendency for some micromanagement with it as well. How do you view the impact of this model? And maybe, yet more importantly, like what lessons can we learn from it?
Yeah, I think the impact of that model and the lessons we can draw from it are first to create clear roles in clear structures within organizations because, to be dreadfully uncool about it, role delegation and structure matters. You shouldn't have employees confused about who makes decisions and who owns projects. That ended up being a big factor in Code for America and a big point of frustration because sometimes it wasn't clear, like, who was in charge of a project, whether it was the engineers, whether it was the project managers, people at that level, or whether it was the people doing kind of the relationships with funders, right? Because they also kind of occasionally had needs too. So I think that nebulousness was very difficult. And although the book isn't a tell-all about Code for America internally, like I'm not someone who's worked there and I'm like, here's all the juicy details about what they did terribly internally. Like that's not generally what I'm doing, but I do touch on that. And again, that as I mentioned with the chapter about empathy brokers and intersectional designers, this is something that someone else could probably write a lot better than I can. Perhaps someone who has worked at the organization. But my point here is I do think this is a downside of what I call infrastructural organizing, right? Where the ambiguity about, what is a viable strategy is never quite articulated. In the way that you prove your worth is you stick around and come up with a, project idea that then, gets enough momentum behind it and enough of a proof of concept that then you can scale it, right? And that's ultimately what uh, Get Cal Fresh and Clear My Record did. They became playbook level projects, right? In very much the same way in the early days, hey, remember Adopt a Hydrant, right? Like that became like a playbook level project. They're like trying to find more Adopt a Hydrants. But I think the narrow play projects really ended up having legs, and a lot of the organization ended up being kind of built around the projects, right? Rather than vice versa. And that's the way Code for America has always been, and maybe how it still is. And there's pros and cons to that. But one of the cons to it is it does give employees a little bit of whiplash, just because it's like one week you're working on one thing, and then another week it's like, oh, the funders, we might be able to get $1 million from this funder, so you're working on something else. It's just a very difficult workplace to be in, from everything I can tell.
In the book's conclusion, you cite Code for America's experimentation, their revealing of things that worked, those that didn't, as perhaps their most significant contribution to the space thus far. What are some lessons you think we should take away from those experiments?
Yeah, and this is what really pulled me into Code for America to begin with. So I'm glad we're ending on it. Like, through Code for America, we can understand both the hazards of tech forward organizing and then also the viable opportunities, right? Um, so yeah, it is, as it's been this test bed for all these ideas. We can look back on them, and some of them, I think in conclusion, we can say, yeah, this really didn't work that well. Like the fellowships, I think that was a particularly, it wasn't embarrassing necessarily, because to outsiders, everything looked kind of good, and nobody really talks about failed tech projects anyways. They just get brushed under the rug, and then the GitHub repository lives on in some zombie mode or something. Like there's not like uh press pieces like written on that stuff. But I do think in retrospect we can say some things were good at achieving certain goals, right? um Code for America has never been that great about filling in the means, right? Like, what do you have to do to get to certain ends? It was always like, we do whatever we have to bring people into government, to do technological work. But I think, in retrospect, and no one else was writing about it. I was like, I do think it's important to learn lessons from this stuff. I think it's important that we recognize that community and government are two very different frames for organizing, and that they may not be compatible. I think it's important to recognize that government culture is very different from tech culture. And so when you put geeks in government, they may not be able to achieve what they want to. I think it's important to recognize that in the case of the brigades, democratic organizing that doesn't produce things of monetary value ends up being a little bit expensive. Democracy is oftentimes expensive, justice and autonomy and a lot of the things that we can consider democratic ideals should be their own reward, right? Um, so on a kind of chapter by chapter basis, I do think we can draw sort of micro lessons along the way about infrastructural organizing, and thereby understand what is worth pursuing moving forward as organizers. Because that's why I did this podcast, like to talk directly to people who are organizers in this space. And I know they're listening, and I appreciate everything that they've moved on to now. And I do hope they read the book and kind of extract these lessons. And then sort of the master lesson, I think we can learn is really about what I just call the hazards of scale. So, Code for America would always do this thing where it's like, we're going to learn through scaling, right? We're going to start by going to, a place, where people get their SNAP benefits and see what that experience is like, try to improve that experience. Then maybe we can improve it online. Then maybe once we have that, we can improve it sort of on a state level, right? So we can move from sort of the local to the state fairly quickly, thereby learning things about how to do user-oriented design, about how to use the stories of people who, are on the front lines of receiving benefits, how to leverage those to get funding. That's kind of what I mean by scaling. Um, but then there are hazards of scale too, where, it's sort of like, could we scale up Code for Tulsa to like a national level? Probably not, because for all of the reasons, that I write about with the Brigades chapter, right? They're concerned with local issues. They have people who believe deeply in local politics, in the relationships that they've formed are with local nonprofits and activists, right? You couldn't just like take that and be like, we're going to do Code for Tulsa nationally or something. So there are good and bad ways to scale. But I think I just want to also say, I don't think it's a terrible idea to think about scale and to always think about ways that we can scale or cannot scale, because I do think that remains a huge, democratic challenge, right? Like if we think about, I think about too, if let's put down the tech infrastructure stuff and think about, I don't know, like recycling plastic, like like it drives me nuts, like we can do this stuff as a society, but because the infrastructures for recycling tended to be based on a model where we would ship our waste to other countries and hope that they do something with it. Like we haven't really invested in, the reverse infrastructures necessary to, recycle that material. So how do we sort of do that? I can tell you how I do that in my house, right? Like I have a compost pile and I reuse, take out plastic and things like that. But, how do we do that on a national level? I mean, honestly, it's getting to the point where our very, survival kind of depends on these kinds of questions. So, I do think that scale, there are good and, better or worse ways to scale, and we just need to not you know, do away with the idea of scale. Like some people are like, well, we do something locally, we can't do it nationally. There's some times where we're dealing with issues where we do have to confront, the hazards of scale.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come on Civic Tech Chat and have this conversation. I have no doubt there's going to be a lot of folks out there that listen to this and take the valuable lessons we've talked about to heart and into their day.
Yeah, and thanks so much for inviting me out. It's been a pleasure to see you again. And again, if people have comments, questions, I am very findable online. I have an unusual first name and last name, so I'm the only one you can find if you search for Arshrock. And yeah, I'd love to know what folks, particularly those in the organizational spaces, that nonprofit orgs are working in, think about.
Oh, and before we depart for real, I'd be remiss not to remember the call to action here. Go get the book. I actually I read the book to prepare for this interview. The listeners may be surprised, and I found it very enjoyable. So if you're into this topic, it's a worthy read. So I would say go out and check it out.
Thank you. Well, you join the legions of readers, like maybe a dozen of people who have read the book. So I appreciate it. And yeah, support your local bookstore, or you can buy it directly from MIT Press. And check my Twitter bio site for a discount code.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat. Visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.